Welcome to Stop Overthinking, the podcast for overthinkers, people pleasers, and perfectionists who want to feel calm and confident enough to handle whatever life sends your way. I'm your host, Kristen, a women's life and mindset coach, lifelong educator, and recovering perfectionist. Welcome back to the Stop Overthinking podcast. I'm so glad you're here. I have been going deep with some of these so-called negative emotions, and today is going to be another episode. My personal journey has led me to a point where I do pretty well day to day with the emotions and not resisting or avoiding them in the present moment. Yet I have discovered that when I did resist or avoid them for almost 4 decades, there is a whole lot of crap to wade through. I talk all the time about how to process emotions. It's an important foundational tool for what I teach. I teach people how to process emotions. And yet there's some of these deeper ones that I'm working on with a coach because I like being guided through the process. It gives me a sense of safety and that I'm not going to get stuck there. Last month, I talked about shame and what that was like for me to experience, process, and work through with my coach. Today, I'm talking about resentment and also some of the nuggets of wisdom that I discovered in diving into this particular emotion. So, resentment can be described as a complex, multi-layered emotional reaction to being mistreated or wronged by another person, situation, or series of circumstances. Often, resentment feels like a merging of anger, bitterness, disgust, disappointment, and disapproval toward the person or events that led to your perspective. According to an online article by psychologist Susan Albers, there's no one specific cause of resentment, but it can be triggered by several things, such as being taken advantage of by others, being put down, dismissed, or ignored, feeling inadequate, overlooked, or unheard, having unrealistic expectations of others or the world around you. It might be that maintaining relationships with people who insist their needs are more important than your own leads to resentment. And it could be having interactions with people who undermine your authority leads to resentment. Expressing the precise causes of resentment can be challenging because it's not always straightforward and it can involve a multitude of factors. The complexity arises due to the intricate and complex nature of human behavior and relationships, explains Dr. Albers. While resentment can be directed toward others, it might also be intertwined with feelings of self-directed anger that necessitates thoughtful self-reflection. Resentment is super common for people pleasers and perfectionists. You might ask why. And the thing is, when you give and give and give, there is less for you. The problem is that repeatedly giving into others' desires and ignoring your own can build resentment and lead to feeling overwhelmed. And ironically, the more you accommodate others while ignoring your own limits, the more you're going to feel depleted and unappreciated. According to Albers, often resentment can make it difficult to let go of your anger. So it's like this spinning in your mind. Imagine that. You can sometimes find yourself hyper-focusing on these feelings, especially when you're confronted by the person or situation that caused them in the first place. You might even be enraged or experience strong urges to seek revenge. All of these things can take a significant toll on your mental and your physical health. And sometimes the emotion of resentment itself makes it hard to stop thinking about the event that led to these intense emotions, especially if you had no closure. During the most intense moments, you might be ruminating and overthinking the situation or having recurring thoughts about the person, place, or events that led to your resentment. And occasionally, you might replay the entire event over again in your mind and wonder what could have happened had it played out differently. Hello, overthinking. These thoughts may come and go, or they can linger for days, months, or even years, depending on what happened and how things were handled. Yuck. In getting ready for this episode, I also referenced Brene Brown's book, Atlas of the Heart. It's a fantastic book. It's almost like an encyclopedia of emotions. I love it and highly recommend it. So, first, resentment is listed for her under places we go when we compare. And that's interesting as it's not grouped with anger. And for me, the two often seem to go hand in hand. But Brown writes that she often associated resentment with her own perfectionism, especially when others weren't grinding or working as hard as she did. And she got angry, resentful, and bitter because there was a disparity of effort in her mind. But in her research, she discovered that resentment is part of the envy family, not anger. And that rocked her world. She writes, I'm not mad because you're resting. I'm mad because I'm so bone tired and I want to rest. But unlike you, I'm going to pretend I don't need to. Another example she gives, I'm not furious that you're okay with something that's really good but imperfect. I'm furious because I want to be okay with something that's really good and imperfect, but I'm not. Boom. For me, the source of much of my resentment lately is with my ex husband. And I'm not going to throw him under the bus, but I'm mad and I'm frustrated and I'm envious that in my mind, he has less of the stress and burden of raising our teenagers. And he's okay with that because he's not doing anything about it. I don't want to be okay with that, but I do want less stress, burden, and emotional labor. Here's the thing, resentment in caregiving scenarios often stems from a perceived disparity in effort and support. So it can be influenced by this interplay of family roles and expectations and unresolved grief. It makes it really complex emotionally. And navigating the depths and complexity of these relationships can be confusing. It can take time to unravel. And for this reason, sometimes the source of the resentment is hard to see and may have evolved over many years. Hello, that's me. I know a lot of my resentment is because other people are not behaving the way I want them to. My instruction manual is very detailed in parenting, for example. And I had to rewrite most of this when I got divorced. And I had to rewrite it again when my ex-husband and his partner had other kids. But there are still things that to me like make sense and they are still my expectations of parental roles. And then I get mad and resentful when he doesn't do them and in my mind I have to pick up the slack, right? And so there's this disparity. The resentment is festering because there's no closure for me, like I mentioned previously. And it's also really hard to set boundaries for my time and emotional labor when my children are in the middle of it. And in this case, their medical care and their physical well being is up to me. So if I don't do it, it's not going to get done. And resentment isn't just an emotion that I didn't deal with. I consciously pushed it away because it seems pointless most of the time. I'm essentially telling myself, like, it's dumb to feel this way because it won't change. So just get over it. So here I'm taking resentment, which is kind of a crappy emotion already. And then I'm like shaming or judging myself for it on top of it. So it just creates more of a mess. And logically, it may make sense that the other person isn't going to change. But that resentment still has built up, and there is a crap ton of it trapped in my body. We know emotions are not solely confined to our minds, right? They also can take residence in our bodies. I've interviewed several people. We've talked about that, the somatic impact and those sorts of things. For example, anger, if left unaddressed, can manifest physically by increasing your heart rate and your blood pressure. It can cause muscle tension and headaches, might give you digestive issues, weakens your immune system, causes sleep disturbances. And then all of this can put you at a higher risk for cardiovascular issues like high blood pressure, or heart disease, or chronic conditions like diabetes or autoimmune disorders. So we got to deal with it. So, what do you do with this resentment that's in your mind and your body? So, professionals will recommend therapy or working with a professional or a coach because it is so complex, like we've talked about. Empathy can also help you see a broader view than your own tangled thoughts. And I talk about this a lot too, using curiosity. And that can certainly help, but you might still have some of this, like I do, that's built up. So I'm not accumulating more necessarily, but what's there in addition to all of the stuff that is simmering below has just gotten to be too much. It also helps if you examine your expectations and you can see if you need boundaries in place. Take a look at your values. Are you in sync? Can you ask for help? And we know practicing gratitude and leaning into self compassion can also be really helpful. So, in the past several months, I have been working through some of these hard emotions, like I've talked about. And one of the biggest differences for me is to actually allow feelings that are trapped and explore what is in my body so that I can finally release it. And I'm going to share some of what happens in my breathwork sessions because I have found the process to be so incredibly helpful with these long held emotions. It's not just the mental part of it, but the stuff that is stuck. Well, for me, part of the processing of the emotion with my coach, we start with mindfulness and grounding in general. It's time for me just to be in the moment, to feel safe in my body. I'm not running anywhere, nobody needs me. And then I just start noticing the feeling. Where do I feel it in my body? And all of my emotions lately are stuck around my hips, lower back, and my abdomen. So I feel it. And I can usually go inwards and I see it. For me, there's always a color. And in this case, it was like a bright red smoke that started lower in my abdomen, like on my pelvis. And I just sit with it. Sometimes, and I did in this case, I talk to the emotion and I ask what it needs in order to be released. And my coach is also guiding me through with questions and keeping me on track so that my mind doesn't wander to, the grocery list or whatever else, so I can actually focus and stay present. For me, this is just a lot of breathing, and sometimes we do the breathing in a certain pattern. Sometimes it's just a big inhale and a forceful exhale, like trying to blow it out of my body. And I'm just breathing and I let it flow in my body. And here it was expanding and I was feeling hot all over as I no longer resisted this. It was like red smoke. If you can imagine like a smoke machine just going, and then it was centered in my abdominal area, and then it just filled my body top to bottom with this red smoke. And I was hot, and I sat with it until it wasn't as strong, and it starts to dissipate. And I feel like there has been some resolution. I don't have the tightness, I don't have the heat. And for me, it's somewhere around 20 to 30 minutes because it's deep and it's ingrained. So when I talk about processing emotions and when I do it with clients, a lot of times it's about a minute and a half. And we'll go through that process. It might be a little bit longer. With ones that are really deeply rooted, that you haven't felt, that you haven't allowed yourself to feel in a really long time, it might be bigger and take more time. One of the things that I noticed as we were finishing my session last week, and we were talking about embracing the and recognizing the duality of pushing down the emotions and the growth. And even can be a duality in itself, right? It's messy and painful and so fulfilling. So I'm looking at how these two things can be true. As a whole, understanding it's not one or the other, but and it can be so helpful with emotions because rather than resisting and avoiding, you can know that it exists and it's not going to last forever. It might be painful and a stepping stone to the future. It feels messy, and I give myself grace to embrace the mess. All of these two things can be true. So, all of my years of accumulated resentment wasn't gone in a 1 hour coaching session, but I do feel that it released. So, it's not gone and it has lessened. All of these ands. I have talked about and in terms of moving to new thoughts and beliefs before, having two things be true. And it is really helpful. And what's so funny is I didn't see it myself. Like that, I could have also used this skill in processing my own emotions. We all have blind spots, right? That's why I, as a coach, have a coach. And as soon as she said, like, can these two things be true at the same time? I'm like, oh, duh. I literally said this an hour ago to my client. So, two things being true. messy, and growing. So, where do you have resentment in your life? If you filter it through the lens of envy, like Brene Brown talked about, what do you come up with? Brown offers this question to reframe it. So instead of what is that person doing wrong? Because almost all the time we have what people are doing wrong when we get resentful, right? So instead of what is that person doing wrong, ask yourself, what do I need but am afraid to ask for? So for me, it could be that I'm afraid to ask for somebody to go back and forth to appointments. It could be medication refills. It might be just the emotions of dealing with somebody who isn't well, right? And that's part of what I have to work through in this moment. And the old stuff that's pushed away, all of the times that I didn't ask. And maybe it's because the person couldn't hear me and I'm not going to get the resolution I want. That is real, but it doesn't mean that I want to keep it trapped in my body. So, in the spirit of learning from what I talk about, practicing what I preach, and the people that I have interviewed on this podcast, we've talked about different modalities. And so I've been noticing where this feels in my body, and I'm also trying movements to release some of the stuck emotions. So I said, I feel this in my hips and my low back. And I noticed that my mobility has decreased a lot in the past year or so. I also noticed that I stopped doing certain movements and even certain workouts. For years, I was a regular at Zumba classes at my local Y. Front row center, I was there. It was one of the few classes that I didn't teach because I wanted it to be just for me to enjoy dancing and for it not to be work. So earlier this summer, I went back to Zumba class after more than 2 years off. It wasn't necessarily a conscious choice to stop when I thought about it. It was my favorite instructor left, and then there was a scheduling conflict, and it just, you know, it wasn't conscious. What's interesting with Zumba, it's a lot of Latin dance. It's a lot of hips. And it was so interesting to notice that my body just was not doing the movements. I was stiff. I was awkward. I felt robotic. And we're in a studio that has mirrors in the front, and it was a little bit painful to be watching. I mean, I've been Latin dancing for 25 years since college, and my body just wasn't doing what it should be doing, right? More shoulds. So I would pick up on the footwork and the choreography and the arm movements, and like my whole torso is just kind of stuck. And when I put this together with where my emotions seem to be trapped, and then I have a desk job that I sit, and it makes a whole bunch of sense, right? Where things are stiff and stuck. And as Shakira says, the hips don't lie, right? So I'm taking all of these things that I've learned, that I've talked about. I'm doing the deeper meditative work to process my emotions. I'm doing the thought work of and the duality and recognizing that working through some of these emotions. And I'm doing some mobility work on my hips and back daily, in addition to the weekly Zumba. And Zumba in itself is definitely a duality for me. I'm in the messy middle right now, and it's progress just for me to show up each class. So even if you aren't personally dealing with resentment, I invite you to go inward with some of the emotions that you maybe have been avoiding. Where are they in your body? And even if you aren't ready to sit with those feelings yet, how can you move your body to let some of the emotion release its hold on you? It might be stuck in your shoulders, your neck, your hips, or your back. And while a massage can offer temporary relief, if you have chronic pain and stiffness, I invite you to consider how your emotional health may be impacting your physical body. So I hope this was helpful to explore resentment, to see how the negative emotions that we resist or avoid can get stuck and accumulate, and that there are options to work through all of those emotions as well. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great week. Be sure to tune in next week as I talk with another podcaster on filling from an empty cup. Thank you for listening to the Stop Overthinking podcast with Kristen. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone else who would benefit from the message. To learn more about working with me and links to social media and free resources, head over to my website, coachwithkristen.com. That's Kristen spelled Kristen. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. Have a great week.